Several years ago, I had to leave the city for work reasons. I usually flew, but since my wife wanted to join me and my company only covered my travel expenses, we decided to drive our car. After my work commitments, we planned to spend a couple of days as tourists, so we embarked on our road trip. We were facing a day and a half of driving, and therefore, we needed to find a place to stay overnight. We had planned to stay in a town halfway, but due to several delays it got very late, and we were unable to make it there to sleep. By then I was already extremely tired from driving all day, so we decided to look for one of those roadside motels you find on the outskirts. Fortunately, we found one. It was in the middle of nowhere. We arrived and went into the reception to rent a room. I must mention that my wife was somewhat frightened to stay there because the place was a bit neglected, and there were no other cars parked. It seemed we would be the only guests. An elderly man at the reception rented us the room. He was very friendly overall. My wife asked if they sold any food there, but the man replied that they did not have that service. Only a machine where one could buy some cookies, but that was it. We thanked him and went to our room, which was at the very back. Honestly, the scene was imposing and quite eerie, as we could see the dark, desolate mountain, with only the sound of local insects in the background. We entered the room, and the place really left much to be desired, but we couldn't complain given the price and because it was the only place nearby to spend the night. My wife lay down on the bed since she was also very tired, while I decided to take a shower before sleeping. Just as I was finishing up, my wife came into the bathroom and told me, "Carlos, someone is knocking at the door." I immediately wrapped myself in a towel and the person kept knocking relentlessly. I went to the door and peeked through the window, but I couldn't see the door's entrance. I couldn't see who it was, but they kept insisting. So from inside and without opening, I asked, "Who is it?" Nobody answered, and suddenly they stopped knocking. It hadn't been a minute when they started knocking again. Annoyed, I asked again what they wanted, and this time a male voice, seemingly young, answered. He said, "Good evening. I am a motel employee. I've brought you clean sheets." I found it strange since we hadn't ordered anything, and there were clean sheets in the closet already. In a low voice, my wife said, "Don't open it, Carlos." I replied to the young man that we did not need sheets, but thanks anyway. There was no response from the other side, and by this time, my wife was quite scared. Suddenly the knocking started again, this time faster and harder. I yelled at him to leave or I would call the reception to call the police. All we heard then were his laughs, that same man's laughs. Then he started yelling with a very terrifying voice, "Now at the f***ing door." My wife started crying from fear and immediately called the reception. The same gentleman who had attended us earlier answered, and as my wife explained what was happening, he chillingly told her that he had no male employees, only a female cleaner who worked during the day, and that at night no one else was there. He was the only one. The gentleman also told my wife to calm down, that he would come to see who it was because he had a weapon to defend himself, that we should not worry. Meanwhile, the man outside kept banging on the door and screaming like a maniac for us to open it, without stopping for a second. The gentleman kept talking to my wife on the phone as he approached. Suddenly he told my wife, "I'm outside a few meters from your room and there's no one here." My wife responded, "But how? They're banging the door very hard and they are shouting for us to open it. How can you not see them?" The gentleman said he would come closer to the room so that she could see through the window and believe that there was no one there. But before he arrived, I decided to open the door and confront whatever was happening. There was absolutely no one there. I only saw the gentleman at a distance coming towards our room, still talking to my wife on the phone. He arrived and asked us what exactly had happened. We recounted everything from the beginning. He kindly, and to calm my wife, who was very agitated, took us to the reception to show us the camera recordings. There, indeed, there was absolutely no one outside, only him talking on the phone with my wife and nothing more. The gentleman felt comfortable with us and told us a story that convinced us even more to leave. He said that a few months ago, in one of the rooms, a boy had been murdered by gang members and left there. His body was not discovered until the next day by the cleaning lady. The police had reviewed the camera footage from the previous night, and it showed several men were responsible for that crime. After that incident, he had not rented that room again, and perhaps it was the boy's spirit who was knocking on our door. My wife and I thanked the gentleman, who had been very kind throughout the situation, but told him that we preferred to go on to the town. He understood perfectly and apologized again, though clearly it was not his fault. In conclusion, roadside motels have a lot of history and are the scenes of strange or tragic events that often occur in such isolated places. Some time ago, while I was working, I left for a business trip with a coworker. As night fell, we decided to stay at a motel we passed along the highway. I didn't hesitate and drove into the parking lot immediately because my eyes were very tired, and I didn't want to continue driving like that. My coworker has poor vision, so he couldn't drive. When we reached the reception, a lady and her husband, who appeared to be the owners of this small motel, greeted us. They rented us a room with 2 beds, and we quickly went to rest. My coworker fell asleep almost immediately, but I suffer from insomnia, so it took me a while to fall asleep. Hours passed, and just as I was about to fall asleep, I heard the voice of a little girl humming a tune. What really made my skin crawl was that the sound was coming from the bathroom of our room. I suddenly opened my eyes wide and paid close attention to confirm if what I was hearing was real. And it was. It was the voice of a little girl singing in the bathroom. In a low voice, I called to my coworker to wake him up, but he didn't hear me, so I got up to shake him awake. However, just then the sound stopped. He asked what was happening, and I told him what I had just heard. Still half asleep, he suggested that perhaps I had dreamt it and told me to go back to sleep. But then, the sound started again. He also suddenly opened his eyes wide and sat up in his bed, telling me to go check. I was honestly scared, so we both went together. As we approached the bathroom, the sound stopped again. I was the one who opened the door and turned on the light, but the bathroom was empty. No one was there. He asked what we should do, and I replied that I didn't know, but that I wouldn't be able to sleep after that. He said he couldn't either because the noise was very creepy. So we decided to stay up for a while just to see if it would happen again. And after a few minutes, that same singing voice of the little girl was heard again. My coworker jumped out of bed and out of the room without thinking, and I followed him. We went to the reception to tell the couple who managed the place and ask them to change our room or find some solution. But what we found was the most traumatic thing I've ever seen in my life. The bodies of the couple were lying on the floor with severe cuts, already lifeless. My coworker ran back to the room again, and I tried to find my cell phone to call the police because they had ripped out the phone wires at the reception. But I had left my cell phone in the room, so I ran back for it. My coworker was there crying, and I tried to calm him while looking for my phone. But then, that child's singing voice was heard again from the bathroom. We froze for a few seconds without making any noise, and then we saw a man with a knife come out of the bathroom, his clothes covered in blood, singing that song in a child's voice. He was slowly approaching us with the knife. I grabbed my coworker and pulled him toward the door to get out of there because he was petrified. We ran to the car, but it wouldn't start, just like in the movies. But finally, thank God, it worked. I accelerated as fast as I could, and we got out of there. The man just watched us from outside the motel, observing us as we drove away. It was incredibly terrifying. I asked my coworker for his cell phone since mine had been left in that room, and I immediately called the police. They told me they would send patrols to the location. We spent the night traveling on the highway until we reached the city we were heading to, but we couldn't go to work because we were still very traumatized. Moreover, they wanted us to go in and make a statement. In summary, they told us that the man who had caused the deaths of the owners was a serial killer they had been searching for a long time. He was a psychopath, and we were very lucky to have escaped. I still don't understand why he didn't attack us if he was there while we were sleeping and he was in the bathroom spying on us. I also don't know how he disappeared when we checked who was in the bathroom. Maybe he went out through the large window there. I don't know. These criminals are already experts at how to disturb their victims. Fortunately, they were able to arrest him because when the police arrived at the motel, he was still there, sitting on the curb, covered in blood and singing in a child's voice. It was the most terrifying thing I could possibly imagine. It is unknown whether he wanted to be caught or why he didn't see us, but we cannot know what goes through the minds of these people. This story is terrifying, yet also somewhat sad. A few years ago, my wife, my daughter, who was 9 at the time, and I went on a road trip. For safety reasons, I won't specify which highway it was or in which part of Mexico this occurred. Ultimately, our plan that day was to reach our destination early, but we encountered many delays and it became very late. It was getting dark, and my wife suggested we find a place to spend the night and continue our journey in the morning, as she was worried about our safety. Those listening who live in Mexico know that the highways can be quite unsafe at night, especially in certain areas. By around 10 o'clock that night, we finally found a motel along the highway where we could stay. Those familiar with these kinds of motels know they are neither the prettiest nor in the best condition, but it was what was available at that moment. We arrived and rented a room. We weren't sure if there were other guests since there were only 2 other cars besides ours, and we didn't know if they belonged to employees. We entered the room and I immediately threw myself on the bed. Within minutes, I was asleep as I was very tired from driving. My wife also lay down, but she didn't fall asleep right away. It was my daughter who stayed awake the longest using her iPad, as she is accustomed to staying up late. I don't know how much time had passed since I fell asleep, but it was already the early hours of the morning when my daughter woke up my wife and me. She said, "Dad, someone is peeking through the back window." I asked her if she was sure, and whether it was a man or a woman. She assured me that she was certain, as she had been watching videos on her iPad when she saw a silhouette at the window, but she couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman because it was very dark and the curtain prevented a clear view. However, the person had lingered for a while before she came to wake us up, and by the time we looked, they were gone. I got up and checked the window, but there was no one there, and truthfully almost nothing was visible as it was all wilderness and pitch dark. I couldn't do anything but close the curtain again and told my daughter to go to sleep since it was nearly 2 a.m. I fell asleep again. However, a few minutes later, my wife woke me up. She said, "Jorge, wake up. I just saw someone peeking. There were 2 people at the window." I got up, annoyed, because it was inconceivable that such uneducated people were spying on us while we slept. So, I went out to complain to the reception. The lady there tried to calm me down as I was quite upset. She informed me that there were no other guests staying there, only my family and me, and that it was just her and a young man who were on duty. But since they had been at the reception the whole time, she had no idea who could have been peering into our room. I insisted that the young man accompany me to check the area because I did not want to let him go alone. He was about 20 years old and did not seem very experienced, and he looked somewhat scared. So, we went out with him carrying a flashlight and me using the light from my phone, and I brought my pocket knife just in case. We walked all around the back of the motel, but found no one. I suggested to the young man that perhaps the intruders had hidden in the woods, so I ventured a little deeper to check but found absolutely nothing, no person. But the deeper we went, the more unbearable the stench became. We thought it might be dead animals because the smell was nauseating. However, what we discovered was much worse. The most horrifying sight I have ever seen was just a few meters from the motel, deep in the woods, a clandestine grave filled with bodies. The young man ran off to vomit. I was in shock for a minute, staring at all those stacked, barely recognizable bodies. When I came to my senses, I ran back. The young man was crying at the reception and telling everything to the girl, who was visibly confused and frightened. He wanted to call the police to report the discovery, but the girl stopped him because she knew that her boss could be involved, the owner of that motel, and it was better that no one said anything because we also could be in danger. I immediately thought to get my family out of there. I went for my wife and daughter, and without giving them an explanation, I told them to get in the car. Later, I told everything to my wife when my daughter was not present, as I did not want her to know that such things happen. I did not want her to have such images in her head. The leisure trip I had planned with my family was completely ruined because I could not get that image out of my head, and I could not stop thinking about all those people who ended up there. Reflecting on it with my wife, we concluded that those peering through the window were probably those tormented souls, perhaps wanting us to discover them. I do not know and will never be sure, but I am almost certain that was the case. Thank you for listening to my story. Take great care of yourselves and your loved ones.